books are hard. And we're here to celebrate that. The feat of actually creating a book is a lot. And, you know, we have some books on display here. But it's hard to show the thought and the labor that goes into it. And it's our profession. Much of what we do is writing books that go on display for a moment in time and then seem to fade away. And obviously we want to celebrate these writers, but we also want to celebrate what we do, our research, our work, our labors, and the craft of writing itself, which is often a lonely and difficult task. And you think, why am I doing this? And then you fall into these moments that are a spark and exciting, and they light you up. And then somehow, miraculously, years after you've written all of this, it shows up in print. And then a few years after that, someone has read it and contacts you. And you think, wow, whoever wrote that was brilliant, and wow, was that me from, 5 years ago? So it's a strange beast, putting knowledge into the world. And you begin to realize it's not just individual, but it's a communal process, that books are something that we work on and we build and we share together. So we're here to really celebrate the architecture, the structure, the community of books and book making and book writing. So you can all get excited about your own writing and your own books, hopefully inspired by today. The Humanities Institute gives an award externally 1 year and then internally for an ASU author, Arizona State University author, on the other year. So here we're celebrating 2 books from different years of awards. First is Jo Guldi, who is professor of data and decision science at Emory University. She's a historian of capitalism and democracy, and she addresses these 2 foundational systems of capitalism and democracy through a history of land and water, who got evicted, who controlled the water, how land was mapped, owned, connected, and used, and what stories we tell about those displaced that has shaped the world that came after. She is also a scholar of history who uses machine learning, statistics, and other big data methods to approach traditional concerns in the humanities. She gave a talk about that around noon today. Incredibly fascinating way of thinking about history and getting outside of our own sort of bubbles, conceptual bubbles, about how we might think about histories. If you weren't able to attend, that will be on YouTube within the next few days on our Humanities Institute channel. Today we're celebrating her 2022 book, The Long Land War, displayed in front of you here. And then Christy Spackman is the ASU professor at the School of the Future of Innovation Society, SFIS, working on how the sensory experience of making, consuming, and disposing of food influences and are influenced by technologies of taste, which is a term used for often overlooked technologies and practices used to manage the sensory aspect of food during production. And finding taste is a difficult thing, as we'll hear. It does not leave obvious traceable trails, but in archives, nor does it leave tangible artifacts. So to get a taste, it means going through government documents, letters by producers and regulators and scientific papers, a lot of different archival work and ephemera. It means having additional training which you have in molecular biology, food chemistry, and culinary arts, all to create a book like this one here, The Taste of Water, her 2023 book. And I have here for both of you a little award plaque, so let me give you that now. So congratulations. Join me in congratulating Jo and Christy in this. And
it's heavy.
It is.
It smells like nothing.
Yes, these are weighty books, so, a weighty plaque. And they'll go over a bit about each book and its history and the labors involved and what it means to create a book. And then we'll have some Q&A afterwards, and there'll be a reception in the room next door after that. So we'll start with Jo and then on to Christy. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having a humanities center that gives out book prizes. Enormous thanks for anybody who was on the panel that read the books and did the work of choosing. I mean, many, many books are considered for these prizes, and that in itself is a huge labor. And it's such a privilege to be here with you. It's really such a privilege. It's wonderful to have your book be birthed and read and come into being. And then it's tremendous to be honored by a prize. It's a book that some people read and some other people didn't read, but it means something to me that Arizona State University is a university that I've been reading about in the Chronicle of Higher Education for 20 years as one of the most innovative and interdisciplinary places, the place that has funny sounding schools and interdisciplinary thinkers. And it makes sense to me, and it honors me deeply that this place would choose to honor my book. So thank you, sincere thanks. So Ron asked me to say a couple of words about the book and then about the writing process and what I was trying to do. And some of you have read it perhaps, and many of you haven't. So I'll give a little bit of a summary and context. And I'll say that it was motivated by the housing crisis. I started writing this book in 2010 as the bottom fell out of the housing market. And then it was swift. 2010 to 2012 was swiftly followed by a period of rising housing costs and rising rents, which have produced this highly unequal world that we live in today. And I was looking backwards as someone who was then a specialist in the history of governance, the history of cities, the history of property ownership, and thinking, what would be the biggest story that I could tell? Maybe not just a story about economists, but a story about how the world changed and how the horizons of possibility change. And I was motivated, what I said to myself at that time about the practice of being a historian was that what I most wanted being a historian to mean was the practice of telling freedom songs. I thought to myself, I was raised in the era of Michel Foucault, and an era when we all were taught to be skeptical and highly aware of systems of surveillance, authority, and control around us, imposed on our bodies at all times. And it's a terrifying portrait of reality for a young person. It's also only half of the truth, because it's also true that the history we live in has been made by grassroots movements, by idealists, by people trying to shape a better world in many directions. And I wanted to be able to tell some of those stories without giving up the precision about systems of control, surveillance, and theft, property theft by the state, by elites, that are so crucial to telling the story of the making of the modern world. So was it possible to tell a story of property, of housing, of land ownership, that recognized both of those impulses, both a liberation story within a story about authority and theft? So that was the idea that gave rise to the Long Land War. It was originally a much longer land war. It was originally a 1,000-year history as opposed to a 100-year history. The original readers said, this is absurd, sent it back, said cut it in half at least. It was 1,000 pages, I cut it down to 500. I've never done something so insane, but I had written this ridiculous book in 2014 where I argued that we should all be writing long-durée histories that looked over the broad scale of time. And I'm here to tell you right now, as I told my dear colleague, Chris Jones, last night, long-durée histories are really hard. They kind of suck. I thought it was a good idea, but actually, I don't know if it's a good idea. I mean, it was a good idea for me because I really wanted to investigate these property dynamics in a scale larger than a micro-history, than one anecdote, a human lifetime. I wanted to understand the biography of the shape of the state and how it was that we arrived at a period of history where it was possible to do property redistributions. And then that window closed. So in that work, I settled on two dates, an opening date and a closing date. The opening date was 1881 in Ireland, date of the first rent control in world history. So rioting peasants argued against the confiscation of property by England. Ireland had the highest rates of poverty anywhere in Europe, the worst housing of anywhere in Europe, the highest rates of eviction of anywhere in Europe. And they invented a new method of protesting those rates of confiscation, and that was the rent strike. They stopped paying rent to the landlord. And the rent strike was followed by the boycott, named for a land agent, Captain Charles Boycott. During the boycott, in solidarity with the rent strikers, laborers literally refused to load onto rail cars or ships the cows and sheep belonging to Captain Charles Boycott. So the newspapers publish engravings of the traffic jam of messy, smelly sheep and cows waiting to get loaded onto rail cars at the station. And then in Dublin, they can't get unloaded, so there's another hullabaloo, and so on. 1974, on the other end, is the date after many land redistributions, many rent strikes, the first rent control laws, spreading from nation to nation, giving land back to previously colonized people, turning over rates of land ownership in India, in Latin America, and most African nations, in most post-colonial nations around the world, everywhere except the United States. In 1974, land reform seems to be heading for New Mexico, maybe California, maybe upstate New York, as indigenous people are organizing, often saying, look at what just happened in Mexico, look at what happened in Peru, Native people are getting their land back. And at that point, the United States, the World Bank writes a memo saying, under Robert McNamara, the World Bank issues a memo on behalf of the United States saying, land reform is dangerous. Henceforth, we should have no land reforms that redistribute, no land minimums, only no land ceilings, only land floors. So the United States should promote larger and larger agriculture around the world. It doesn't matter if people are evicted. The United States pulls the plug on its funding of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is the part of the United Nations charged with supporting land redistributions all over the world. And around the same time, there's a Republican attack on USAID, which has been supporting these grassroots movements around the world. So these dates are important because they're an opening of doors in 1881 and a closing of doors in 1974. They bracket a reality where for about 100 years it was possible to imagine a rethinking of government that leads to redistributions of land and water, leads to more general housing rights, and the definition of housing as a human right, and the idea that it could be enforced at a national level or even at an international level. And it leads to a lot of creativity of thinking about what's necessary for that right to exist. Maybe you need not just grassroots movements, but infrastructures for collecting data about the land that's being up and divided into farms so that we're not handing out rock and desert here and loam there. Maybe we need lots of map makers. Maybe we need lots of academics, lots of social scientists, understanding land ownership patterns around the world. These infrastructures are housed at universities, and at the United Nations itself, and they serve the very developing, very poor nations of the world. Bengal is asking for this expertise. So it's not about surveillance and expertise in the service of confiscation. It's about surveillance, it's about understanding, collecting data, and then producing expertise in solidarity with grassroots movements around the world. And that's a new finding. So maybe this book taught me how to think about the kind of long-durée history, the kind of very long history that I wanted to write. I found myself understanding that it was necessary to identify a starting date and an ending date that were distinctive, that hadn't been seen before as having consequence on a global scale. But also within the text of the narrative, I wanted every chapter to contribute not just a retelling of an old chestnut, but the discovery of an episode or an event that was barely known outside of a local, regional literature. So I told the stories of Indian activists and New Mexican activists who are important to local studies in India and New Mexico and Latino history, but had never been told in the context of a long movement. And I connected them. So the distinctiveness of the event was part of what I discovered. And aiming for the distinctiveness of events over a 100-year time period is a lot of work. It's like the child who's building a sandcastle, who spends time unearthing each individual shell from the many grains of sand around it, and then compiles a series of shells before they discover the perfect spiral to crown the tower on the sandcastle. You have to see all the shells, and each shell has to be dredged out of the stuff around it. So that's what the work of a really long-durée history is like. It aims to be truly novel. It's made one event at a time. Each event has to be extracted from an archive in a different place. And you don't know what the shape of the entire narrative is until each one has been assembled. So that's what I mean by it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and I'm not sure that I recommend it, although I'm really happy that I did it. And then I want to say just something about what I think the message of the book is and what the message of the book is now for this time. I gave a talk about data. Right now I'm a practicing data scientist in a data science department. It's the other weird thing that I did. This is not a data-driven book, but it profiles the life of information and all that we do as social scientists, humanists, data collectors, data analysts, or just ordinary citizens to collect and share information about the world around us. I have stories about peasants in India who started literally drawing their own maps in the sand or using rocks and shells to show the pattern of housing and property allocation and to have conversations about who was responsible for pollution in the lake where everybody got their water. I have stories about the cartographers hired by the United Nations to create soil maps for Bengal when Bengal started doing property distribution. Information work, creating shared infrastructures was a huge part of the vision of democracy, the vision of housing rights for all, resting on facts collected by everyone in the name of everyone. And it's a vision about how society can work. It's a vision of a different kind of activism than the activism of marching in the street, although we've got lots of stories about people marching in the street as well. And it's also a vision about what the university can do. One of the things that we do as scholars is to write books like ours, but also to collect information and create information infrastructures that serve civil society by helping us all to arrive at facts, shared facts about the world around us. And I think that's a very important charge at this particular moment. The stories of these movements point past individual social movements, to the role of universities and university-trained technicians in finding new ways of documenting and making public and accessible information. They point to the need for democratic points of access to infrastructures that serve information about our world. And they point, above all, to the crucial role for solidarity between elites and ordinary people, between experts and ordinary people, brokered through international organizations like the UN, through nonprofits, and especially through the university, which has the power to convene vulnerable people, to show off the modes of activism that actually work, and to so breathe life into movements that are otherwise struggling. Today's housing crisis and its ongoing land crises, which are real because indigenous communities were largely left out of the land reforms I'm writing about, and the accelerating climate crisis all point to a broader failure of governance. While carbon and methane emissions are meticulously measured, the impacts of climate change on low-income communities worldwide remain far less understood. Climate diplomacy has produced frameworks for international coordination, yet we still lack a coherent global approach to managing scarce resources such as land, water, and atmosphere, resources that must be governed within clear ecological limits. What's missing today is an administrative imagination equal to the scale of these intertwined crises. Earlier eras of reform, whether land redistribution, housing policy, or environmental protection, advanced when states, experts, and social movements worked together to define clear rights, responsibilities, and limits. But today's institutions remain fragmented, with authority dispersed across national governments and local jurisdictions, and international bodies that rarely can coordinate their mandates. As a result, the governance of essential resources has become reactive rather than preventative, addressing emergencies after they erupt instead of creating durable systems that safeguard communities and ecosystems alike. I think we can learn from this period of activism in the Long Land War, and I hope universities have a tremendous role to play in imagining broader and more effective administrations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was really interesting, and also a great warning to the rest of us. Do not pick a 1,000-year history, to say the least. I'm going to start us off with a short little video.
Introducing Chicago. Pure, refreshing drinking water. Not from some island around Fiji. Not from some fancy glacier somewhere in Scandinavia. But from Chicago. A city known for its skyscrapers and sports teams and hot dogs. But you know what else it should be known for? Exactly. And there's no shortage of it, since Chicago's snuggled up next to one of the greatest expanses of fresh water on the face of the earth.
Hey, Michigan.
In fact, this whole city exists because of water. We're just a pit stop between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, where this gentleman happened to set up shop. We raised our entire downtown over it, reversed the flow of it, even stitched this blue on our flag.
Oh, so that's what the blue means.
Point is, water's our entire past, and our city will be turning it into clean, refreshing drinking water well into the future. So drink Chicago, whether it's from a can, a faucet, or pretty much anywhere, because it's literally Chicago tap water. Chicago. Available everywhere, in and around Chicago.
Have any of you had Chicago's water?
Yes?
So I think you've all experienced this thing I'm about to talk about, which is where you go somewhere new and the tap water tastes completely different if you are a tap water drinker. If you're not, you've missed out. Because it turns out that there is this amazing world of diverse culinary experiences all around us being shaped by a bunch of scientists and engineers. And my book asks, how is it that we got to a world where those amazing differences between the tastes and smells in our drinking water are something that we don't pay attention to, and something we don't think about. And this started for me in 2008. I was walking down the street in New York City as a graduate student and walked past a pop-up shop. This is in the midst of the fiscal crisis. And there were people standing in the window with bottles of vitamin water 10, doing activities that it would take 10 calories to burn, like rocking a teddy bear for a certain amount of time or jumping rope for a certain amount of time. And I was so curious, why were people willing to pay a lot of money for what was essentially filtered tap water with some color and flavor and a little bit of sweetener added to it? And that started this whole journey, which I thought initially wouldn't involve tap water at all, and ended up mostly involving tap water, to try and understand the work of managing the tastes and smells that are found in the water around us. Now, those of us who live in Arizona or are visiting Arizona have experienced the fact that we have a very flavorful water here. That's the nice way of saying it. Some people would say it's disgusting. Others of us would just say it's interesting. So it turns out that Arizona's water, just like many of the waters around the world, reflects the land we live in. It's salty, and I'm going to invite you to do a drinking challenge after we're done talking. I have different waters here, from saltiest to least salty. And you can pick if you want to go super salty to least salty or less salty up. And my challenge to you, one, is to notice the difference, and two, to pick the one that is most like Arizona's water. Because one of these has a level of minerals in it that is really similar to what we get from our water in our taps here. Now, it turns out water has not always been the way it is. We all know that intellectually, but do we know that viscerally? And coming to understand that history and follow that history has really been an effort. Geographers might call it a follow the thing sort of approach, but to follow the flavor and follow the management of flavors and the effort to make those go away. And for the early folks working in Chicago, they had this big problem. And that problem was Lake Michigan wasn't only a pit stop, it was also a dumping ground, it was an industrial lubricant, it was the space where you drew your drinking water. And so if you turn your taps on and chicken feathers come out, and in addition to that, not only do you have chicken feathers, but you also have this nasty medicinal smell, you're not going to be very invested in saying, this is a water I want to drink. In fact, you might march up to City Hall and complain, or you might just go buy a bunch of drinking water from a bottled water supplier. And that beginning in the early 1900s is what leads to this effort by chemists and engineers to start figuring out what can they do to mitigate that, and also how can they talk to each other about it. Because talking to each other about tasting and smelling experiences is actually kind of hard. Now, I don't know about you, but when was the last time you said to someone, I had this amazing thing, and then you try to explain to them what it was, and they just look at you and smile and nod. Everyone's done it, right? And so this work for the folks in charge of water, it's not just a fun thing to say, hey, I found this flavor or smell in my water and I managed to get rid of it. It actually carries this really interesting challenge. If I figure out how to do something here in Arizona, can someone who's living in Indianapolis, whose water supply is completely different from mine, doesn't have all this calcium in it, it's a little short in sodium chloride, etc., but maybe has a lot more of some other interesting, funky flavor set, will the technique I developed here work there? And so in my book, I trace the effort of those techniques and technologies to circulate between different places. By the 1980s, we end up with this effort that really draws, oddly enough, from the beer and wine worlds to figure out how to talk in a way that everybody could perhaps share. So rather than being a connoisseur of water, which if you haven't noticed, pay attention to the news, there's a resurgence of the water sommelier. Instead, they tried to become a democratizer of water, a democratizer of the flavors, and linking those flavors to the molecules. So your everyday person working in a small municipality or a large municipality could talk to each other. And they go through all of this work of identifying as best they can the smelly things, the tasty things that are present in water, linking those things to a molecular identity. And then once you know that molecular identity, you can potentially, with limitless resources, treat your water so it tastes like nothing. Now, we're not there, but we are kind of close. And many folks here in Arizona have gotten as close as they can by either installing reverse osmosis whole house filtration systems or using a Brita filter or some other filtration device to take the pretty good water that we have coming out of our taps and turn it into whatever imagination we each individually have of what great water should taste like. And my book invites us to, one, celebrate the work that people have done in making water not only safe to drink, but better tasting to drink than it might have been otherwise. And two, it invites us to question what that erasure of taste is doing. Because I suspect that as you start removing those tastes and smells that link us to the environment, you're also removing a call to action. So if earlier, when your water was polluted, you acted on something, now, if you don't know that there's all this work going on to make your water safe and to make your water taste okay enough, are we choosing not to act? Now, I have this hopeful bit at the end where I invite people to reconsider their own likes and dislikes when it comes to water, to sit with the funky smells that are just actually an indication that it's getting cold, that show up in the water here in October and September. What's really going on is the lakes and our reservoirs are starting to turn over, so all the flavors that are down at the bottom are starting to come up to the top, which is why it starts smelling a lot more like earth than it did before. So when that happens, to celebrate, because it means it's cooling down, as opposed to say, why is Phoenix's water so bad? Granted, I know it's hot. I can't deal with that. One of the other things that Ron invited us to think about beyond just telling you about our books, was also why write our books the way we wrote. My understanding is both Jo and I have written a book that seeks to make accessible to a larger audience the conversations we're having. And for me, that was a really important ask of myself, to try and figure out how could I write a book that not only could my colleagues want to read, but also potentially someone whose job it is on an every day to walk into a municipal water supply station or utility and take care of the water, to invite them also into thinking about what the work is they're doing, what the history is that's associated with it, and how they might want to see that come about, or that my local council member might read it. Have I succeeded in that? I don't know. But I do know that when I go to water conferences and talk to people about their research and then end up talking about my book, they go buy my book, which is really exciting. And then they tell me they've read it, which is also really exciting. Not very many of them, but some of them. So, cool.
Yeah, so there's just opportunity now if you have some questions or things you want to talk about in terms of books.
So I had a chance to attend the noon talk with Jo, and we were talking about different chronologies running along, and it got me thinking about you ending in the 70s when Possibilities shut down. And I feel like actually a lot of the chronologies I have, the 70s are a real breaking point. And I think that, like in the environmental movement, like in America, you get the major passage of laws from 1969 to 1973, and then sort of whittling away after. You obviously have, by the early 80s, neoliberalism come along, and that radically changes the conditions of possibility for all kinds of things going on in the world after that. And obviously, you have a sort of global period around the oil crises of struggle in the late 70s, and that seems to alter conditions of possibilities across a number of stories. But what you did, and so I'm seeing a parallel in like what I've written about, what you're talking about here, but your talk earlier was like, actually, if we broaden this way out to other cultures and other things, maybe we wouldn't see the 70s as a universal changing point, but as a more particular one. So I hope that's enough to bring others into the conversation from what we had before, but I'd be curious if you had any reflections on thinking about the 70s as a distinctive era for your book, for some other works, and then also what might be narratives in which it would not be as important.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think many of us have been trying to explain the rise of neoliberalism in different ways. So for an intellectual historian like Quinn Slobodian, the 1970s represent an inflection point in the sense that millionaires buy their own intellectual constituency. And then there's the OPEC crises and perceived labor crises. I think when I was doing this work, one of the phrases that kept turning up in the literature from the United States that I paid a lot of attention to was the crisis of rising expectations. You still occasionally hear this language applied. And the crisis of rising expectations was a social science theory which explained why people in the developing world who had just been granted post-colonial status, independence from their former colonizer, who had seen rising levels of income and the right to vote and ownership of land, right, land redistribution sometimes, kept on asking for more rights. And sometimes authoritarian governments came into place subsequently. As a theory, it's basically an attitude of pessimism. Like, you can't keep asking. It's like the way we talk to our 5-year-olds. Like, you can't keep asking for stuff. You just got stuff. A crisis of rising expectations is that mom has had it with you. So is that really a way to describe what happened with post-colonial countries? I think it's a reactionary description of how certain economic elites understood the battle for human rights in the developing world, facing OPEC, facing blackouts in Britain, facing labor movement strikes, that there had to be a crisis and inflection point. And sometimes, as your own work shows, this was channeled through a description of economic growth and the limits of possibility, the limits to growth. Sometimes it was cast as an environmental message. But I think you're also right in hinting at the fact that this was the perception from the United States and not necessarily a global perception. If you had taken the temperature in the 1970s in Kerala or West Bengal, it certainly looked like land reform was finally cresting. They were finally getting the kinds of policies that they wanted. They were finally redistributing land and creating rights for tenants in the way that they wanted. And those movements kept on going. And what I took pains to show in the Long Land War was that also the creativity around new solutions like participatory mapping kept going around the world in other shapes. Creativity doesn't stop. The social movements keep on inventing new technologies. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a question also for Jo. If you could give us an example of one of the movements or strategies, maybe it's the mapping that you just mentioned, that you think could be particularly helpful in this country in these days. And I'm also wondering if there's what the connection between land and water is, because so that maybe there's a connection. There's a connection between your two topics.
Well, I think there certainly is. I sort of waved my hands a little about the right to water as an extension of the right to land, because in many places, water rights are anchored to owning land or having inhabitation. But I think it's no accident that the Clean Water Act comes in the midst of these arguments about housing as a human right. It's the same logic of common ownership of property. It gives us roads and gives us public parks. It gives us the possibility of land redistribution and public housing. It gives us public water reservoirs and municipal utilities that are charged with providing water at a reasonable cost to their inhabitants. And I'd be interested to hear you comment on their erosion. But first I'll answer the chronology of their erosion. But first, your question about what is an activist technique. At the end of the book, I have a table of the technologies of the activist, and I give a sort of long list. And among it, they include marches, they include empathy, they include participatory mapping, they include counting evictions, simply collecting information on how much the rent has gone up, how much the price of land has gone up, and publishing it in newspapers on a regular basis. And I found myself saying to audiences, so we have the stock ticker in the newspaper every day, we have the weather every day in the newspaper. During the pandemic, we had the rates of death from COVID, the rates of infection published every day, because these are public sources of information that we all need in order to make decisions. Should I wear a mask today? Let me look. How high is the rate of infection? But we don't have regular publications of the rate of rent, certainly not every day. But it's a crisis that working people face every day that impacts if 80% of your money is gone to pay rent, as we understand is the situation for many, many working class households in America today. You know, that 20% left over has to stretch very far to cover food and transport, let alone education or leisure. So, you know, I think information is the key, and that information can take many forms. And if you want more stories about technologies of liberation and how to publicize information, please read the book. Copies are for sale at a table just around the corner.
May I build off that? One of the interesting things about the taste of water is that it's not considered legally in the US a human right, nor is it's considered secondary. So you should have water that doesn't include contaminants that are considered dangerous, but the contaminants that aren't necessarily contaminants, they might just be part of the water supply that people don't like, are not considered something that's necessarily worth removing, which creates this interesting hierarchy of taste experiences within our municipal water system, where the folks who may be most stretched when it comes to questions of rent or other things are also folks who, if they wish to opt out of Phoenix's very flavorful water supply, have to do so at what you could consider significant cost to themselves. So one of the core invitations I provide in this book is to reconsider taste not as a secondary thing or as something we shouldn't pay attention to, but rather something we should, because it's a form of data that struggles to be codified and shared. Especially when you take into account the different ways in which those sensory experiences are so linked to our childhood, are so linked to the value systems that we grew up with. And so this invites us as folks who participate in some way or another in a municipal water system to reconsider when we turn the tap on and say, I don't like the taste of that, thus I'm going to opt out. Whether I'm going to opt out is actually the choice that we want to make as collaborative citizens in a community, and whether instead that choice might be, I need to find out what's going on in my water system and why, and either start pushing for additional fees to raise the small, like the very small amount we pay, even though it might feel like a big amount. It's really small when you consider how rare resource water is, to make better tasting water, or to consider what other alternative systems we might want to invest in as our infrastructures age, as we have the opportunity to build new infrastructures. And in Arizona and many other places in the US, this is a really critical moment because our infrastructure has aged enough that we're rebuilding, that there are massive investments being made.
Thank you for your beautiful stories and data in your books. I would like to ask both if you can talk about the cover. So you both have 4 images. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, yes. And if you can let us know how you chose them, like how like you pick them, more beyond the editorial process, but like how they relate. Like at the Taste of Water, it's people tasting from like a public park. And then this is for Dr. Christy Spackman. How does the delivery of the water influence the taste, like someone drinking from, like a source, like a fountain versus glass versus plastic? For me, the plastic does make a change, and I don't like plastic bottle, so I prefer tap or glass. But anything you know about, and it was surprising to see that really, really nice can in the video. So I never tasted from can water. I tasted other beverages, but so the covers and the delivery of the water and taste.
Do you want me to go first? I'll start backwards. So as far as the delivery systems, this is one of the fascinating challenges with our water infrastructure in the US and elsewhere, which is municipalities are responsible for the water supply up to the property line. And beyond that, it's the responsibility of the homeowner or the landlord. And this creates what you could call a massive quality challenge for the municipal water providers, because they cannot control. Like, these folks have control over this, in a sense, until it gets into your home. It's packaged, they've made it inert as best they can, etc., and then put an expiration date on it. Versus the water coming into your home encounters a variety of different things. So those pipes, they all have an impact. And as we know from paying attention to what happens in Flint, Michigan, how well our municipal water providers pay attention to the chemistry of that supply and the pipes they're running through is a really important thing. So for example, as Arizona moves towards a direct potable reuse, we don't have very many lead pipes in our water supply infrastructure because of how late Phoenix and Tempe and other cities were largely built. But we do in our wastewater supply. And so you're moving from having a water supply that doesn't have lead in it to a water supply that could potentially have lead in it, which imposes new challenges on our water producers. Obviously, if you're a chemist and you're doing potable reuse chemistry, they have to clean a lot of stuff out, so cleaning the lead out is relatively easy. But it is a reminder that thinking with infrastructure is really important. And so even if we're thinking about taste, we're actually thinking with infrastructure. I agree. Plastic makes it taste different. For my book cover, I wanted something that demonstrated that the folks who drink water aren't just humans. So there's an important little bird also taking a drink from this drinking water supply. This is a picture that's in the Library of Congress. My press invited me to send them images I liked, and this was one that spoke to me. In a magical world, it would have a shimmery foil cover to reflect the shimmering of water, but that's an expensive world. So I really was searching for something that captured the fact that our water supply and the taste of water itself are linked into much larger ecologies, and our attention to taste is also an attention to an ecology. I should add an asterisk. I am completely aware of the fact that there are many folks in the world who don't even have access to clean water, let alone, well, that water might taste good, but it might not be safe. And yet, I still think it's important for us, where we do have access largely to clean water, to pay attention to taste, because it links us into these larger questions of ecology and right to an experience that some people have chosen to not necessarily make equitably available.
I have a much less interesting story. The designers at Yale University Press designed that cover. I had very little to do with it. They sent me a selection of options. I chose that one.
Yeah, I've got a question for Christy, and it has to do with kind of the taste between sort of publicly available tap water and these kinds of things that you've got on the table. Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like the public managers like don't have access to the knowledge maybe that they have or something. Like, how are they doing the thing? But that doesn't seem to be or there are parts of that process of what they're doing with the flavors and so on of those waters that are then branded and mm-hmm. supposed to be more consistent and so on. that are just more difficult to implement because of the variety of water sources in the public, or sort of what is that kind of interface between essentially private drinking water and public drinking water?
Mm-hmm. And by private,
I don't know. I mean, like just
by private, you're meaning something
like
this.
branded drinking water.
So these to me are really interesting objects because historically this was medicine. Specifically this one because it's so mineralized, and yet Phoenix's water is mineralized enough that it counts technically as a mineral water. You could bottle it and sell it as a mineral water and brand it just like Chicago. There's a reason I showed that. But you might want to potentially do some additional steps to remove the geosmin before you get there, which is the main thing that causes that earthy, corky, musty, green. There are many descriptions of it, but the thing that also is the smell of rain is very heavily found in our water supply. The biggest difference I see, they're using similar technologies. They're using similar, especially when you're getting, this is obviously an unbranded one, but you can imagine, insert whichever brand we have out there. Those are just our municipal water supplies, additionally filtered. These guys, on the other hand, are drawing generally from artesian wells, so it's deeper underground. So you can think of it as what the city of Goodyear used to be doing until recently, which was drawing their groundwater supply up. And we've largely, in Arizona, chosen to opt out of that approach because of the additional environmental hazards of the subsidence of the land, et cetera. And so while I brought these in part because this is the easiest way I have of allowing you to taste the difference in total dissolved solids, which is one of the core things that we have going on here in Arizona and one of the core things that people struggle with when they encounter Arizona's water. And this thus allows me to reframe and invite ourselves into saying, wait, maybe it is a fine water, just with some extra, like, it's got flavors. They're interesting flavors. Maybe we should start figuring out how to pair that. That's me being a little facetious, but also me being a food person who's really intrigued by what those flavor experiences tell us. But these remind us of a history where water was medicine. And thinking with that history, even though I don't do this in my book, I am constantly doing it. Thinking with that history reminds us to look perhaps slightly askance at the packaging and the claims made. And the best example of this currently out there is Liquid Death. If you haven't tried it, it's not a particularly good water, but the packaging is so beautiful. Have you seen it? You know. And the idea that maybe we just need to reconsider how we package our own water is also, I think, implicitly an invitation in having these here. Did I get that, Jason?
Yeah, I didn't have an agenda with it, but like for example, this summer we were on a road trip and we went to Hot Springs, Arkansas, mm-hmm. which I'd never been to, but is obviously known for its springs, and it has a very long medicinal kind of history around that, both for like as a spa, but also there's just like public water available mm-hmm. everywhere, like in these like really beautiful fountains, and people will just come and with a jug, and you know the water's kind of always running, and you just put your jug up to it.
How did it taste?
I mean, it was very minerally. I feel like my vocabulary is. I was just. I mean, I didn't drink a lot of it. It wasn't something that I would like want to have a lot of. You know, it's not like, oh man, I've just gone for a run. Like, let me get some lukewarm water. But it did have a kind of medicine-y, you know, it felt like a real Victorian, enlivening sort of drinking experience. But it was also interesting to just sort of have the public water supply celebrated so publicly. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that I've seen very many places around the country. And it got me thinking about, you know, sort of this difference of like, what makes that brandable as opposed to sort of, you know, the water in Memphis, which mm-hmm. is not all that far away. Like, or whatever, and how that gets to like sort of different styles of consumption around what's desirable when it comes to a drinkable water.
Absolutely. I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. You'll taste it. This technically is considered undrinkable by US EPA standards, just so you know. It's very drinkable. It's very salty. So such an interesting tension. I hope your Victorian top hat also magically appeared while you were there.
Yeah.
I love the invitation that's implicit when we encounter a spa-based mineral water to rethink, once again, what's happening when I'm drinking a water? Why am I taking it for granted? And also, what does it compare to? What's the ecosystem it sits in? And in my book, at one point, I actually explore this effort in the early 20-aughts, so 2012 to 14 or so. Starts a little bit before then, ends a little after, but by the city of Paris to essentially rebrand themselves. So they go from, like we saw with Chicago, Paris goes from, they're transitioning from being a public-private partnership to a completely public water supply. And while they're doing that, they end up out in the streets doing water tastings, inviting people to like taste the water, to sit with it, to think with it. The first year they do it, they do a head-to-head with Evian, which is essentially what their mineral water content is really parallel to. And then after that, they just do their water on its own merits. And I got to be part of that effort and see the ways that people interacted with it. And for some people, this effort at rebranding really actively shifted within the larger ecosystem of saying to folks, hey, plastic bottles are a problem. We need to rethink this, where people moved actively towards engaging the water. And they even offered carafes with each arrondissement or neighborhood's name on it, so you could have a little bit of neighborhoodly pride while you were drinking. And so this effort to reshape public thinking around the water itself, I think, is something that's really valuable and worth thinking with. And I think Chicago's biggest failure with that ad is they ran it like once or twice, and that was it. And I still think that should be, one, that's a lot of money, but two, like, there's such an interesting set of messages going on there about what it means to value your city water supply that I believe all municipalities could draw
on. I'm curious about generational changes and cultural changes around water, right? So, like, I mean, you mentioned Paris. Like, when you travel to Europe, it's expected to get sort of bottled water as opposed to tap. I mean, generally, or had been at least. I haven't been there in a while. Whereas, like, tap water is common in America. I'm also thinking about, like, I mean, granted, I grew up in Ohio, but like, I didn't carry a water bottle around, right? And granted, I raised kids in Arizona where it is the desert, but you know, I've had people of my generation be like, did you drink water? And it's like, maybe out of the hose when we were running around outside. But like, drinking water was not, like, there's sort of generational, there's spatial components. I'm just curious if you have any broad reflections on how, on those. I'll leave it there.
Farah is demonstrating for us, as is Lauren. So, we have some really great colleagues here at ASU, actually, over in the Phoenix campus who work on hydration. But hydration itself as a concept has a history, and that's a history that really comes into being in tandem with the bottled water industry as we think of it today, the plastic bottled water history. So the idea that you needed to be hydrated has always existed, but the idea that you must be hydrated for good health is really something that starts emerging not even in the 80s, but 90s and a little later with the advent of the PET plastic bottle and its widespread circulation. And so this is not my own work I'm drawing on a lot of other folks' work. But that history we have has also been shaped by a right to access to water known as the water fountain. So water fountains used to be widely available and accessible, like in this park, and then you start seeing a disappearance of water fountains. So next time you are at a football game, at a professional football game, I haven't paid attention in ASU Stadium, but a lot of football stadiums don't even include a drinking water fountain anymore. The idea is this is something that can be commoditized and we can make money off of, therefore we will remove the drinking water fountain. I would guess, but have not poked at it, that there are also public health concerns that reemerge in the 80s and 90s with the HIV scare, where public fountains reemerge as a source of potential contamination. They had with the advent of germ theory also. So there's a history to why people are carrying water bottles around, and it's largely shaped by plastic.
I was wondering, both of you have objects of study that would be interesting to a wider public, and have you written anything, maybe sometimes just prior to a book or just after a book comes out, you write something for a broader public, and have you done that, or have you thought about doing that, and maybe why or why not?
I've largely tried to talk about this rather than write about it. So podcasts, other things like that. Life goal that I haven't achieved yet. How's that?
It's interesting, podcasting really is a medium today for pushing ideas, pushing books. So it's sort of a parallel medium, right? So some people like to listen rather than read, or it might entice them to read something. Yeah.
I also blizzarded the world of podcasts with anecdotes from the Longland War when this came out. And I guess word has gotten back that was successful, especially in connecting with present-day housing activists and other activists who are reading it. I was also on a lot of law school podcasts. So that was fun, because maybe the next generation of lawyers will recognize that we have had common rights to land and water and atmosphere in the past. I wrote op-eds working with the press department at Southern Methodist University, where I then was a very different experience than working with the press department at Brown University, where I had been previously. I'm sad to say that there really are differentials in how easy it is to get your story out. And that's not universally true. There are colleagues who have networked really well with journalists and with press agents who have had better success. But it was really difficult. I mean, talking about the relevance of the United Nations and land rights in the 20th century turned out to be a hard sell, even though there are clear lessons for present-day activists and about the affordability of housing. So, yeah, you win some, but not others.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there is a lot of work. It's a lot of work to write a book, as we all know, but then the book comes out and there's a whole second level of work, which is letting people know about the book and the work of the book. And that's often one that, as academics, we're not taught about and we're not prepared for. But I think increasingly in an information-saturated world becomes important in order to get the word out. We do have something from an online question. One of the viewers asks, I'm an environmental humanist and I recently incorporated data analysis with a digital humanities approach. The contradiction between advocating for environmental conservation and using extractionist tools that have a negative environmental impact is something that bothers me, especially since AI consumes so much water. Is there an environmental friendly approach to data science? Is there a conversation developed about this with concrete plans of action?
So it's a great question, and I wish I had more of a solution than I have. What I know is that there are computer scientists who care deeply about environmental issues and who have made it possible, when you as a individual researcher run large amounts of code or use artificial intelligence, to choose to run it through one of the data centers around the world, which is powered by hydropower in Iceland or by solar panel power. So you can choose to make your pipeline, your individual pipeline, responsible. And it's much more difficult to think about with artificial intelligence as an industry because we have $1 trillion corporate empire that's building data centers across the United States, sucking up vast amounts of power, as much power as Argentina or as Japan, and expanding with no apparent limits in sight, other than the possible crash of the AI bubble. So what is to be done about that? If you ask certain true believers in artificial intelligence, they'll tell you that if you really care about the planet, you should endorse AI and work for better and clearer AI, because AI will expand to such an intelligence that it will solve the problem of environmental governance or create affordable solutions for cheap energy. And so limitless economic growth will solve the problem. We have in our audience the author of a treatise on the history of thinking about economic growth, who would caution us that this is also naive and doesn't even take into account the economic study of environmental economists who have put this all into perspective for a long time. So to me, it looks like a kind of rebellion of elites, to borrow a phrase. So if I'm looking back towards a moment in time launched by a progressive era where elites are actively going into the slums and living in tenements and meeting the children and tutoring the children of immigrants in order to forge ties between the university-educated and the rest of the population. We're living in a moment where the elites have physically and intellectually isolated themselves from the rest of the conversation. At least the elites, not the university elites perhaps, but the elites who are in charge of Silicon Valley and in charge of this $1 trillion investment. And there are real, if you believe in the reality principle, if you believe that history has material consequences, that we require an atmosphere and land and water to survive, you have to think that that is eventually going to come crashing down. But that's about as much of a prediction as I can hazard. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not aware at this moment of any strategies or movements to bring it into control. Thank you for the question.
So thank all of you for the conversation today. And one of the beauties of these books is that they launch these conversations and draw us into community. And I hope it inspires all of you to keep researching, keep writing, write your own books, and submit them for awards and get the word out into the public. We have a reception following this next door. Please join me in congratulating Jo and Christy.